Hello.
Hello, hello. Hello.
In the bunker, Stefan?
Yep, it feels like it. It's a pretty damn small hotel room I got this time. Like I think the bathroom is like 1.5 square meters.
That is a fake background though, right?
Or is it?
How do you know how big the bathroom is?
You're saying this, you're catching me off guard here.
But it was impossible to catch you off guard.
Aw, you just aren't trying hard enough. It's pretty easy, my friend.
It's like this fancy.
Yeah. Ah, it's one of them. It's one of them. I know those well.
Oh,
This is better.
yeah, that looks bigger.
Yeah, it's actually the second time today I hear your voice, Abby.
Oh, I'm so sorry. What else? What else did you get droned on about during?
No, I listened to the one of the podcasts you were in recently,
Oh.
or I guess it was recently. But actually, no, no.
Maybe. It's also when was it recorded versus when does it come out? Sometimes I'm like, what is that? Oh, I did do that like 3 months
Oh,
ago,
oh,
you know?
it's from June.
It's amazing how long the lag time is between recording. I recorded one, but like a couple of months, 3 months ago, and they haven't even started the podcast yet. They're trying to get a backlog of
Yeah.
Ah,
you
Yeah.
know,
It's very weird.
okay.
You kind of have to know that when you're a guest, because you're like, can I say like coming up at or like recently at
Please
or
don't.
like do I need to act like I'm just like, in the Netherlands where time does not exist and I can't like, you know.
well, it was bad because Colin was giving his lightning talk, and he was giving all the resources. Oh, what about the podcast? Like, that's not really. He was like, he looked a little,
Yeah.
not sour, but like a little.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it comes out eventually. So it's still
Yeah,
good
and
to
then
do.
then you have the fun stuff when people introduce them, like, yeah, I work at this place, and like 6 months in, when they release the podcast, like, oh, I'm not working for them anymore.
Mhm.
Don't think people can come directly to the Zoom, if I remember. They have to go via the.
Ah, speaking of people who left, I think David Grisanti was still giving New York Times stuff when he had taken a role at Google. Like that's the other thing is you go to conferences, right, after moving, and suddenly you're giving a talk about a company situation that you don't actually work at anymore. So,
Yeah, that is always an interesting one. All right, we've got at least two people trying to get in on the Zoom. So should see Saeem and Chris shortly. Um, if you aren't already in the doc where the questions are or the notes doc, those are those two. And we are working on, per our notes, on interfaces today. So,
Now I feel like the bad student because my week has been so busy I didn't add anything.
well, you're out of here.
Aw,
Out of here, I say.
I'll just go and grab my pizza then.
Oh, if you bring me pizza, you're allowed back in.
Pizza.
Yeah, like one of the best pizza places in Oslo is like right across the street.
All right, let us kick off. So, uh, as usual, I think we're going through the doc. So continuing to kind of work our way through the 5 aspects. So we're on to interfaces and trying to get as much feedback as we can on there captured in this doc, because we're going to have sort of the coalescing phase at the end of all of this, but we want to make sure we get the feedback and the awareness of how different people would approach this during these conversations as much as possible. Yeah. Think anything else from anybody about way of doing this or other things?
It worked well last week.
Yeah.
Before we get started, I have a question about the actual model itself. If we could talk about that. A little confused between levels 3 and 4, between scalable, kind of focused on self-service, and then integrated services. You know, there's a, to me, a huge amount of overlap. Like to create the definition of self-service is maybe fuzzy to me, because the things in level 4, I would say, like if I provision an app self-service, I should get a whole bunch of built-in things. Like it's not clear if maybe the description of self-service would be, oh, you have access to maybe some opinionated stuff that still creates raw resources for you, but doesn't create pipelines. Because to me, the definition of self-service is I go in and I create something relatively high level that I don't need to understand, like an entire application. But that doesn't seem to be there until level 4.
So I think from my perspective, you're speaking more about the capabilities right now, but we're on the interfaces aspect. So like this is more about how people access stuff than what they're accessing. So whether or not they're accessing something that is high level or low level, something that is like abstracted or high abstraction level, low abstraction level, lots of complex things built together or one single thing, that's actually independent, in my opinion, of this aspect. Versus, so I'll read out the first
But it's in
sentences
the
of the.
scenarios, right? So that's part of the issue
I'm sorry?
I'm having is the example scenarios actually talk about some of these specifics.
Cool. Yeah,
Like
and we can
injecting
look through this.
NFRs about observability agents and things like that. So, I mean, it's put there as part of the aspect in order to kind of document the levels.
In order to like pull it out. I think maybe so again, from my perspective, and that it's only one perspective, right? This is a group thing. So I want to hear other people. It's like the self-service, like the first sentence is around providing autonomy about accessing stuff. But with the level 4 being it's things being integrated into the tools and processes people are already using. I think that's one of the big things that I remember conversations being around, is that like self-service can be through a clunky or not native way for somebody. And when we're talking about interfaces as like the key kind of topic here, if you give someone.
Okay, so if you tell someone to go and use, for instance, ServiceNow in order to create a pipeline,
Yeah.
right,
But
versus maybe
I've,
command line tooling purpose made for the job that they would be using anyway.
That would be one example, I think,
Okay.
that you could use. Yeah. Chris?
I've always found the level 4 examples a bit misleading, but the way I've read them, I found it much more about just a single component provisioning and more of a fully rounded product where a lot more of that opinion was getting injected, and that's the way I've always read it. So kind of 3 is API for components, but you probably need to orchestrate different ones together. There'll be some level of opinion baked in there. But when it came to level 4, it was fully opinionated, much more formed. You don't really need to understand that, the Kubernetes cluster is going to come with the opinionated stack. It's going to have your observability. It's going to have everything, basically.
I think one of the ways that I was asking about this in the survey I was doing was kind of the distinction between, do I need to learn a completely new set of tools, or could I use the existing set of tools that I'm already like comfortable with and familiar with, right? So, if there was like already standards around certain things, like in the example of like a service desk or whatever, people are pretty familiar with that. If I said, hey, you need to go use this Argo workflow, and I'm like, I have no like knowledge of Argo and like all that Kubernetes stuff,
Yeah.
like the bar to entry is going to be way harder. So that was kind of the way that I was asking this in more of the yes no format, was like, can I use what I already have, or do I have to like, learn something completely new?
And just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, Corbin, like which levels would those relate to? I might have assumptions about what you're saying, but I want to make sure I'm explicit.
Yeah, I mean, at the time I wasn't really mapping to the levels, which I think we're doing a lot more effort on right now, but um I don't know, when I was reading the difference between like sort of level 3 and level 4, I can imagine um like in level 3 I can imagine maybe interfaces around things like a developer portal or something else that um changes the way that I do work compared to level 4, which might be just using the service desk, for example, or maybe a standard pipeline that the whole company's using today or something like that, right? So that's kind of where my mind was going when David was asking the question. So the distinction between like a platform specific implementation detail versus an enterprise-wide capability that already exists, basically. Like the platform specific one could be self-service, but you have to know where to go, right? You have to, you, like one of the challenges I think some of my customers have is around adoption at a certain phase where they have to make everybody know where the developer portal is to get started. And that's kind of the jumping off point for the documentation, the interfaces that they can consume, like all that stuff. It's still self-service once you get there, but it's not like something that everybody uses every single day, like the help desk, right? Um, so that's kind of the distinction I'm making there.
So I
That
think that's
that
similar.
that question is there, by the way, Corbin. I think that's row 9. Does the
Okay.
platform provide daily utility to the developers? Right? That was one of your questions out of your list.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like it's highlighting some really interesting things with that conversation, because I think, Corbin, your read aligns with what what I think about when I read it. But what David's asking is a very reasonable question.
Mhm.
And the way that you just described it, Chris, I can see it helped me connect those dots as to where the assumptions were coming from, because actually you talking about how bespoke to the business the thing is, how like baked in the requirements of the business are for that platform capability, isn't actually captured in the model. Like
Yeah.
that would be actually like a pretty interesting kind of blog poster, right? Of like the missing component of this model. Like, is that like where is it kind of mentioned or hinted at? But like what like
Well, that's where I thought it always was in the model, right? That bit there at level 4.
yeah.
Because when I look at level 3 and level 4, the answers are kind of very different, which I totally get what David's asking, right?
Yeah, no, it's totally reasonable. Yeah, yeah.
It's very open to interpretation, that one, and that's how I've interpreted it. But listening to you, I get you're right that it isn't explicitly called out in the
Yeah.
model at all.
Yeah, I think the reason that I'm so I see where you're coming from with the examples. I see where the question's coming from, and I agree that we need to like cover that aspect, or like that would be a reasonable aspect to cover within this. I'm a little bit concerned about muddying interfaces with the like capabilities below it, because interfaces are like the top level of it is interfaces, how you just interact with and consume the platform, right? Which is different from what they're consuming, right? Like
Yeah.
that. And so Yeah, I'm glad that you raised it ahead of us getting into the questions, David, because I feel like this is foundational to how we address the questions.
Well, and it sounds
yeah.
like maybe this section, like a lot, most of the other sections, the other two sections we've gone through already,
Yep.
it's been pretty straightforward. Maybe this is a 0.1 or a dot one version of,
Yep.
because I don't think we could release a self-assessment when we have this many questions about the two levels, right? And we can't make recommendations for how to get from one level to another, again, if we're not super clear on how we've defined it. So maybe we go with a provisional definition internally.
Yep.
Of just level 3 is self-service, but more or less abstract, closer to the underlying technologies, and level 4 is more integrated with opinionated tools of that particular enterprise.
I think
But
when I
still
look at,
focusing on interface on that. Sorry, Stefan.
yeah, just like when I look at the level 3, it seems like you compose it yourself, kind of ish, and it writes something like day 2 operations is not really clear either. So it's like when you reach level 4, it's like you get a nice composable package, and like everything comes with it, and everything is just unicorns and butterflies all over the place.
I had 3 as almost like self-orchestrate, but the individual components or APIs, whereas 4, as I said, was much more fully rounded. It was you make one request and it's doing all of that for you.
Kind of like if it's self-service, all right, I can create a pipeline self-service. All right, do I need to go and create an observability
Exactly.
workspace? Do I need, like, I can do all of these things myself, but the orchestration isn't necessarily there.
Cool. I'm documenting this from what I'm hearing in the notes document, which I will share again in the chat here, just because I think like this is how I try and make sure we're all hearing the same thing. Is if like people all heard it and they read it and they like those seem to align, then hopefully that means that that we're all on the same page and can move forward with that like sort of shared understanding. So orchestration.
I do
Cool.
think that there is often a discussion around the level of abstraction that's not like well defined. And so I was like trying to think about this in different terms. And one of the things I noticed was when I was talking, I was I went back to look at like the top level, and it says for adoption, it says why and how do users discover and use internal platforms and platform capabilities, which I could kind of relate to what I was saying as well, right? It's more of like it could be part of the adoption thing, like people don't know where to go, right? And then when I was thinking about interfaces in a different light along the capabilities axis that David was talking about, I could see this discussion coming about like, well, what level of abstraction makes the most sense? Because I think a lot of people struggle with that. Do they make it super abstract and black boxy and like advanced, or do they give people a lot of switches and knobs and allow them to kind of customize some of the offerings? Like, how does that work?
Where the level of interface comes down to the level of discovery, right? Do I need to discover that so level 3, you kind of need to figure out that there is logging necessary or logging possible. Whereas level 4, it's done for you, right? And so you don't need to discover that. It is just simply part of the platform that it takes care of that NFR. So, and I'd say that's an discovery and interface are very, interrelated. And remember, we might have questions that cross over. We decided that pretty early on, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, do we want to jump into the questions? I noticed, like, I read the first one and I saw Chris had a comment there, and I totally agree. I don't know that having a definition specific to the open API spec is a necessity. I don't know.
The reason I queried that one is I've actually come across that internally. You know, we've got open banking, right? Is it in finance is a kind of standard, and people are applying that, and so we start having these people who have been working on these APIs, external facing APIs, coming along trying to tell us what the standard's going to be, and I'm like, I don't need to do that. My platform API doesn't need to do all those bells and whistles that you've got. And actually, when you're listening to team topologies, there was a great talk at KCD last year. I think it was another bank where they basically just described using the team. In fact, it might have been Fastflow actually. They started talking about just using the team topologies API, which is nothing more than a Confluence page, but it helped them change their entire organization. And so when I was reading that, I thought, nah, I'm not with it being open API. Who says it needs to be? I think the question could be reworded a little bit to say, I can't even remember my comment now. Who says it needs to be open API spec? It goes against that API thinking from team topologies. Could be just a wiki page. Perhaps just change it to say, do you have API access to your platform, and what format is it? And then we could have those as the kind of questions.
But does it matter the format, or?
No, I don't think it does. That's the point.
I think it's just that making it open API specific implies too much, again, around implementation, right?
I can't remember. Was it you, Abby? Sometimes you need to smear lipstick on a pig, or was that?
No,
Yeah.
that was Abby.
That was Whitney and
Yeah,
I.
like as you said in that one, like it can even be a Word document or whatever, as long as it's a structured way of doing it.
I was trying not to quote Abby's one, right?
Yeah,
She's got so many of these. She's not going to. Her head's going to
Uh,
explode.
yeah.
I do
I
think
I
that-
listened to her for an hour this morning. I just need to give her some credit now.
I think it's a good shout by both David verbally and Chris in the comment, written into the comment of like, I think the intention of that question is around having a contract, like more than anything else, and an API being even you could argue a technical implementation, but would indicate that sort of, the interaction model. But so I think if we look at it as like, do you have a complete like kind of contract or API spec or something to that effect for your platform? I think that's a really reasonable thing to ask about, is like, and I think there's even more, like I've been talking a lot to a lot of people about like, does that contract like provide clarity on like who owns it? That gets into sort of the operations. So I'll hold back on that stuff. But yeah, so we've got that comment in there already from Chris. I think that captures your question there, David. Around like, does it need to be open API spec?
Yeah.
Cool. So we got that.
Do we want to rewrite it instantly, or?
Can do.
Do you guys feel strongly that it has to be an API? Maybe Abby does.
Define
Well,
what you
I
mean
think-
by
I think
API.
I think maybe the determination would be, does your platform have some sort of programmatic interface? And we can be flexible with the idea of programmatic. Is it a text file, GitOps? Is it an actual API that's available through SDK? Is it, that's then that, leaves open.
That is implementation as well, right? Like in its own way, like the fact that it's programmatic, and to Chris's point about like even just having it on a wiki. I think, Corbin, where I care about API is about, so the things I care about for when I use the term API is that you have the ability to version it and evolve it over time, and that it separates consumers from producers as long as they adhere to the shared contract. So like, in my opinion, this is where I lose friends. It's fine. So I get over it. I cry myself to sleep at night. But when I say that like, Terraform modules and Helm values files are not APIs, they can be a contract, but they're not an API, is because if you want to change from using Terraform for your implementation model as the producer, you couldn't. Like, you couldn't use a Terraform module and put Crossplane behind it, or ACK behind it, or Pulumi behind it. Like, it has to be Terraform, and that's what makes that a contract, and that's great. Like, that provides a certain level of, like, we know what the inputs are, we know what the outputs are, we know who runs stuff, maybe, and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't create that API of separation of implementation between the two sides. So I personally, I feel strongly about the value of that. Like, whether or not that is captured deeply into the maturity model to where we need it to be deeply invested into this assessment, that I have less of a strong opinion on, right? Like, I can separate my personal opinions from, like, where we went with this document, and therefore where we're going with the assessment, right? So
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think, well, what I had written in the question that I had originally was more about the types of interfaces that were self-service. So it could be a portal, it could be an API, it could be a CLI, like, and so that's why I was asking the question, like, do they have to have, is the language specific to an API, I guess, is more of what I was trying to get to.
I think there's a difference between an application programming interface and a user experience. To me, a Confluence page is user experience. And we see it as kind of interface, right? But it is essentially a form of information, not actionable, right? Whereas like an actionable interface would be any one of the things that we're talking about, portals or CLIs or APIs or whatever. Maybe we just need to make the distinction. There's ultimately this whole section, right, is about different forms of user experience.
And it seems like the key there is to your point there, Corbin, of like CLIs or portals or whatever, is like, I guess the question I'd want to ask people is like, are your interfaces new? Like, I think it was mentioned by someone else, like, new for the users in a certain way, right? Like, is the thing that you're introducing for the way they access your platform something that is like that they have to learn to be able to use your platform and only to use your platform? Or like, is their interface is something that they are consuming regularly, that is like well within their sort of like current job, and therefore something they interact with a lot and they understand how to use, and they're just sort of plugging your platform into that, or like getting access to your platform capabilities via that, which would be like an example of sort of integration into it. But yeah, yeah, something like that second one that you just put in the chat, Corbin, of like, it's around like, does it meet you where you are, or are you like completely changing how you do work to be able to get access to this platform? And as in the talk, what Whitney and I said is, sometimes you want to completely jolt people from where they currently are, right? And that it can be an intentional ask, but like, I think that it's my experience with conversations with people recently, like over the last couple of years, is like, it's less intentional that people are like, I want to jolt people away and into a portal for a reason. It's more like, the portal is the easiest thing for me to orchestrate and provide, so I'm providing that. Then like, yeah, so it's about that intention of it.
So now I
Are
have
those
the circle of Abby, because I was actually part of the podcast I heard this morning, where you go back to saying like, sometimes you need to like force people away from old habits. Like,
Yeah.
that's the intentional stuff you do sometimes.
Exactly, and that can be intended. Yeah, exactly.
But I think like when we talk about API in general, like, it needs to fit into what people do today. Like, yes, we can do intentional stuff to move people away from old stuff, but that's not really like part of the maturity model.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And it depends on who your users are, right? Because those developer portals, by their definition, are focused on developers. But if you're doing a transformation exercise, you can still use the platform via the API and the CLI, and you probably would use it more programmatically. You probably would use the API. If you had to migrate, let's say you're migrating, I don't know, Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and you were going to take that and you're going to migrate that to Kubernetes, you're probably going to be calling a lot of APIs and doing a lot of the onboarding. You're not going to be having people self-service deliver that themselves, right? You're probably going to take your existing platform, call those APIs, create the namespaces, shove the existing applications through some sort of build pipeline and do all that transformation very programmatically rather than using that UI. So it really depends who your users actually are going to be for these different use cases. It could be the same solution, but it's just different interfaces to it. Could be the same platforms, what I'm saying, right? But just different users, different interfaces, different ways of coming to work. Shall we move on to row 4?
Definitely feels like this is the hardest one yet of getting the right set of questions in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But yes, sorry, go on, Chris.
No, I'm just saying, should we move on to row 4?
Yep.
I think I'd put a comment on that one as well, but it looks like it's been rewritten since I put the comment in. Is this more of an adoption question than an interface? Perhaps the question is around if the interface is human rather than programmatic. Right, okay. So I kind of got the gist of the question. I don't know who put it in, but it was all, I think the way I read it is it's along the lines of, you know, is your interface a human? And what happens when that person is not there or leaves or whatever. And I have seen that for platforms, right? You've got a kind of concierge, everyone goes to them, but what happens when they decide they've had enough and they leave? The next person isn't exactly the same. So I thought it was, I don't know who put it in, I thought it was a worthwhile question because I've seen that and it does relate to the maturity. It's not very mature if you're relying on a single person, right?
No, and one could argue, is it really a good platform if only one person in the team wants to use it?
Well, it's almost back to Corbin's point though, right? About, you know, if people don't know where it is, if you don't have a developer portal and it isn't signposted, but you know you go to Billy and Billy sorts everything out for you, what happens when Billy's not there? You know, you kind of need to move to a developer portal, right? Scenario, because you don't have Billy anymore.
So that'd be in the custom processes way, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not even standard at that point. Like standard might be, you know, Billy, but Billy actually just depends on pretty clear IAC, pretty clear things that anyone on his team could trigger. You just happen to know Billy, but like, and it'll be annoying to figure out who Billy's teammate is Anne, but like Anne can do it for you too, and like because it's all automated, it's all consistent once it's actually done. Like, and that would be the level 1 to 2 sort of jump maybe.
So I thought it was a reasonable question, to be honest, and it did relate back to the model.
I was writing something in 14 that kind of encompasses this process thing that's in the characteristics of each level, you know, kind of how do you interact? Is it, or how standardized is it and consistent? You know, is it entirely organization and people interaction based? Is it standardized tooling, but still people oriented? Is it self-service? You know, like I think we could maybe have a question that kind of determines the individual levels.
So we could probably merge 8, 14 and 4 then, because 8 was really focusing on a lot of the, does it enable self-service? How's it doing that? Is it a developer portal and API only, request-driven approach, which is kind of 4, right? That human-centric one. And then what you're saying, David. So feels like maybe all 3 of those are ripe for a merge.
I don't know that we probably need to be careful of merging too much though, because these are taking on slightly different areas and, you know, the answers might get too complicated, right? If we try and include too much in the same question.
Yeah.
Because I think enabling self-service is maybe a somewhat different question for how standardized, you know, I think API only, no request driven approach is a little different than like, I don't know that the answers to this one give you the level view. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking out loud.
It was kind of me that put that one in there. I mean, I thought the request-driven approach, neutral language, trying to get that across as level 1. And I've probably gotten the wrong way around. It's just the way it happened in my head. I think, yeah, the first one is level 3, the second one is level 4, and the API one I had down as level 2. So I probably need to move them around a little. It's just the way I banged them out.
I think the other thing too is I don't think every question needs to have an answer that maps to every level necessarily. It just needs to map to whatever one. So in the case where we have a few yes or no questions, like the yes or no is not going to map to all 4 levels. It's going to map to like 1 or 2. But when we add up the score at the end, right, it'll contribute to pushing you into, you know, a certain category at the end of the day. So I think like one of the things that Abby and I had talked about like a long time ago is like there should be some questions that help us back test like some of the levels in some cases, right? Kind of confirm because they'll be worded in a way that it's pretty obvious like you know, if I pick the first answer, I'm at level 1. If I pick the last answer, I'm at level 4, right? And if we have that pattern throughout the thing, it's just like, yeah, I'm level 4, I'm level 4, I'm level 4, right? Like, and I
Yeah,
don't need to work on anything, like,
it turns into a loaded die.
Yeah, you're better mixing them up. So I'm glad
yeah,
my
yeah.
dyslexia mixed that one up, right?
Yeah,
To be
so
honest, I just filled it in because it was the way I started just thinking about them, and I knew in my head what I meant, right? Because that you're going to start. Most people start with it's ticket ops, make a request, somebody does something, and we know it's you want to be there. Then they might start thinking about like team topologies and API, some sort of clear, even if it's documentation or a proper API with automation behind it. It's kind of like level 2. Then they'll start putting a developer portal in there and pointing people towards that. That we know is level 3 from what we read today. And then 4 is obviously, yeah, all of the above, please.
But it's
Developer
fun.
portal, API, CLI, hit me with a whole lot, right? That's what I want. That's the most mature. All things to all men. Silver
But
bullet.
it's fun when I see different companies, like most of them start up with nothing and it's ticket ops, and they want to jump straight to the developer portal and not think about APIs and CLIs. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. But there was some really good examples at KubeCon, right? Of people just using the developer portal for documentation, for signposting, linking to their existing automation that they had. They weren't claiming they were level 4, but actually had a decent level, a decent spread, right? They were ticking the boxes in lots of places.
sort of to loop back on this one, I think like for me, as we talked about, number 4 smells a lot like adoption, I think. And then I can see 8 and 14 having their different kind of values depending on how we phrase them. Or was it the 4?
Yep. So no need to merge. You kind of agreed with the comment. They're all valid.
yeah, I think the other observation I have too is that some of these questions are kind of always the answer's the same whenever I do this. So for example, the one about self-service, it's kind of like I mean, everybody's gonna say yes, they have some form of self-service, right? And I don't know if we care what kind necessarily. Like, I don't know if it necessarily maps to one of the levels. There's always going to be some form of that, right? Whether it's a ticket queue or something else. So
You
I
can
don't
put in a
know.
ticket yourself. You don't have to go get someone to put it in for you.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like when we start thinking about shedding questions, like we should try to figure out what are the ones that really offer some insight into the maturity, right?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, we have self-service, of course. Like everybody, if you're doing something in this area, you should have self-service. Like, Otherwise, you're not really doing it. So I don't know. Maybe that's one that we just kind of take out and focus on like something a little bit more insightful, I guess.
Which one are we on now? 4, 5, 5. Is that the next one?
Yes.
Are there any sets of support standards for product engineers to develop applications and all its related components? Set support standards. Is that an interface question? Doesn't feel like one.
I guess it tries to address like level 4.
So which one are you talking about? 14 or?
5.
Five.
Doesn't feel like an interface question though.
Well, it's funny because you're talking about the interface. We think of the interface as provisioning and infrastructure, but the interface is also for the developers to the things that they're using in especially the runtime part of the platform. Right? So what's the interface to sending logs? Is it just configuring log4j, or is it running a logging library provided from the company?
Right.
And
Well,
one of my sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I'm not reading the answers as that though, David. I don't know whose question it was. Was that one of yours?
No.
No. I'm just not reading the answers as what you said, because that kind of makes sense to me what you said, right? How do the developers interact and use the platform and its features? I would totally get what you were saying there. And I would get it if it was also asking about and how do the developers contribute to the platform as well. If it was reworded around about that, so if they wanted to contribute to the observability or the storage, how would they go about doing that? I could understand that one if the answers were like that, but I'm not getting the answers.
I think for me, that first answer would make a little more sense if non-engineers could build and operate on the platform's offering, on the platform offer. So basically, the application stack upward, right, would be up to them. And the platform would offer Prometheus, but not recommend a Prometheus library or a connection, generator or things like that.
Seems like it's more of a capabilities question again. And I was looking over my list. I had a few other capabilities ones as well. Like I was thinking about things like it feels like this is more maybe this is the level 4 integrated thing, right? Where I was thinking about things like certain platforms will start out just offering like basic stateful or stateless, like you can deploy stateless applications here kind of thing. And then they get to, yeah, we can support like a variety of workloads. We can support machine learning workloads. We have database platforms. We have, or we have, you know, Kubernetes as like an API use case where they have Crossplane or one of the other things where they could spin up like lots of different other services from a single place. Um, this one's talking about observability and storage, for example, but it could be any other service or external resource. So maybe it just needs to be rephrased into something like that, and then you could talk about the types of capabilities. I don't know.
Feels like
Well,
it needs reworded though.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe instead of mentioning components, uh, maybe it needs to say like how do the developers integrate with non-functional capabilities of the platform, and is it we provide a service, you and documented way to talk to it, integrate with it. We provide, preset configuration, or we just take care of it for you. Like as examples, and you don't have to mention what the capabilities are even. I mean, I think talking about some of the stuff without actually mentioning storage, or like, I think talking about capabilities gets a little abstract sometimes when you're trying to get this across. But saying capabilities rather than components might be, and specifically saying that they're, non-functional might be an important distinction for this one.
We can definitely make sure capabilities is like a defined word within this, right? Like, so we can start to like reduce the, because I agree, capabilities, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. But capabilities are easier, we can make it more defined as opposed to components, which can be pretty loose.
And
Uh,
capabilities would lead off of the white paper, which is always nice to be
Yeah.
able to like have consistent language across the
Yeah.
documentation, right? So
I can try rewording this a bit if you all want to move on to 6 and then take a look back. Does that work?
Yep. Works for me. What's the degree of help is needed to be done by a product? Product engineering to execute protect. Again, is that an interface question? Because if the interface, I mean, that one's kind of about the human element there, right?
I
Again,
think it's trying to target like level 1 professional custom process in the first response.
yep.
Yeah, it's actually trying to nick some of the bullet points from the different levels I see. Like level 3, only some complex process, or for example, A2 operations that needs help from platform team. That smells a bit like one of the bullet points from level 3. I'm actually getting more and more confused when I read through the characteristics of the different levels multiple times.
it's always the sign of a high quality white paper.
Oh, there.
No, no, 50 reviewers, don't look at me. Yes, no, I think I've just added a note to our rolling docs. Like this definitely is the section that I would say I have the least confidence of like kind of grabbing these questions and running with them, right? Like this conversation, the reason, the value of this being like recorded and all these things, we can come back and we can listen to this, right? We can like reacquaint ourselves to this context of like why this was challenging, but this will definitely need sort of another pass through. Whether we want to do that again next week or whether we do that like later in that smaller kind of wrap up situation, I don't know. But
Yeah, I'm really not sure about this question being appropriate for interface, but maybe I'm too blinkered on what I think the interfaces are. Maybe that's just my bias shining through.
are you on which line are you on, Chris? Just
6.
6.
I know this one's about the kind of human involvement, but that to me is just an interface. I wasn't really getting into the different levels of human interface, because I saw that as kind of, a particular level, not like, I don't see that applicable to level 4, to be honest.
I do hear Stefan asking and or like calling out, and I do think sort of that self-service aspect is, and so I think we talk about in the level like 2 standard tooling, it's like, sure, it can be done, but like, and you can do it by yourself, but you probably will need help to understand like the language it's written in or whatever, because it's like not made for you. So, you could imagine, I like the answers I think could help make this more or less relevant to interfaces, right?
Yeah.
I think like when I just like step back and like look at this, I'm a bit worried about like the interface part, because it seems like we're having a lot of discussions like what is an API, where is the interface? Is it like, have we actually hit like the weak spot in the maturity model here, or are we just like not aligned on what we actually mean with the different levels?
Yeah.
No, it's a good shout. I mean, David called out at the start, right, that level 4 is a bit, the examples are a bit, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, and there seems to be some crossover between some of the bullet points. I think there was one bullet point in level 1 that actually sort of like resemble into what is written in a different setting in level 3.
So we've identified an area for revision
Yes.
in the
Great.
maturity model.
Yeah.
Can you have that for review by tomorrow, Abby?
So given the time, like, so we're not quite at our hour yet, but we're getting awfully close, and
Yeah.
like with that sort of question in the air, I think it'd be one of the good things, I think, is knowing what we want to work on between sessions, right? Because this is like async and then come together to like sort of discuss. With all those questions, what is our homework that we want for the next week coming into it? Do we want to say, you know what, let's park interfaces? Like we've flared this up. I've got the notes on the doc. There's no question this is flared up as like not ready. But do we want to try and get this to ready? So like spend another week and somehow create some homework for ourselves that will get us to a better spot by next week? Or do we want to just sort of mark it and move on? And basically then we have like the hot spots that we can come back to on like future meetings. How do people feel about that?
My vote, I've got someone coming in, so my vote is mark it and move on. I think we made great progress the last weekend, and this one, just do the same and just keep trying to plow
Keep going.
through.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was thumbs up for the I see.
Yeah,
all the-
yeah. Mark and
Yes.
move on.
Cool. Well
So I
then,
need to
Chris,
drop
you can
someone.
head out, operations, get moving on it. That's your
Yeah,
homework.
wife's
Is
just
what it
said
sounds like.
someone's at the
So-
door. So
Yeah, go by.
oh no,
okay.
no, it's not. It's fine.
Oh,
Take over.
what a tease. Okay, so yeah, so we'll do operations then next week again. And as I said, this is definitely marked. All of them were saying, hey, these aren't in final states, but I would say this one feels like we may want to basically have like someone try and create a more polished version of to like come back to where like we've made assumptions and we can come back. So if anyone wants to, like, you don't need to write the second, but if anyone wants to hand raise to like kind of take that on, we probably won't come back around for it for at least 2 more weeks, because we'll do operations and then measurement in the kind of pattern that we've been going. That'll close out our
Christmas
year.
and New Year, Abby.
Yeah, so we've got
Because the next 2 Tuesdays are horrible for or like next week is good, and then we're like
and then it goes
right
into
for 2
bad.
weeks.
So okay. And I think I actually already had them canceled. Yes, so they are not on the
Yeah.
calendar already, I believe. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong calendar. That's why it's not on that calendar.
Yeah.
That'll be one way to not have it on the calendar, is look at the wrong one. So yes, we have one for the 17th. We do not have one on the calendar on the 24th or 31st, because those are pretty global in people's holiday schedules. And so yeah, so what we'll be saying is that the 17th, so next week we'll go over operations, and then we'll come back on the 7th to do measurement. So if somebody wanted to, between now and like 7th or 14th, kind of put a head down and be like, I've got a plan for my read of interfaces based on our conversation here as a group, and try and get something that's a bit more like single voice polished. That might be a way for us to cut through the noise on this one and say, okay, we've got one person's perspective, and we can kind of ask those questions, those hard questions of, does that match the model? Does that match other people's thinking, etc., in a better way? But that gives a few weeks. So throw your hand up later in Slack, or just do it. And if we have a few versions of it, that'll be a great test in its own right of how those versions collide or complement each other. So, but we would come back around to it probably January 14th. So, not for a while.
Yeah, and you're thinking like from the maturity model perspective, not the questions perspective, or
I was thinking from the questions, to be fair.
Yeah,
but
okay.
if like in doing those questions, you're like, the maturity model actually just needs to be addressed first, like that's a thing that is a reasonable thing to raise. Like, it has to be prioritized and done and all that. But like, I
Yeah.
don't want that to be off the table as an option, right? Like, if we are finding that we can't fundamentally assess against it, that is a
That's an
reason to
issue.
come back and revisit it, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's not like mince words there. I have no problems with saying that. And like, we're basically putting this to the test, right? And not that we didn't do a review the first time around. No shame on any of the like authors or reviewers. But like, this is really kind of putting it through the grinder now, and that will teach us something, and we should listen and we should apply. So
Yeah, I'll probably go over like the 3 previous tabs anyways, and like go through them and like have a second look at all of them before we reach them again.
okay,
And
awesome.
probably start out with interface.
Yeah, well, it needs the most time, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah, it seems like.
So ops for next week.
Yep.
Operations for next week. And I'm just putting into the notes doc, like, we'll revisit interfaces on January 14th. Like, we could restart from the start, but I think since this is the hottest spot, I'd rather come back straight to this one, and then we can come back to adoption, etc. later if we want to. Like, there's no requirement that we go in order. And I'd rather start with the most painful thing and then move forward, because that just means that we'll spend the time on the right stuff. So ask is for people to write.
Yeah, as I recall, we didn't manage to finish adoption. I can't remember if we actually managed to finish investment.
Don't think we managed to finish either of them, but that's okay as well, because there's going
Yeah.
to be a smaller group of people that we say, we're going to polish this thing based on the conversations, based on the questions that are there, and we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
When we do
Yeah,
that.
for
So,
what it's worth, I had some challenges with operations as well.
woo! Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think it will be important to kind of look at the definition, like the current definition of operations, how our platforms and their capabilities planned, prioritized, developed, and maintained. It's not operations in the typical sense of things like availability and resiliency and things like that, right? So that was an interesting sort of experiment working with customers on this, because that's kind of where their mind goes
Their
initially.
brains go.
Like,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, do we have monitoring and observability in place and things like that versus
Yeah.
like, how do we operate as a platform engineering team?
Yeah.
Right.
The DevOps model of like actually like operating the
Mm.
whole cycle.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll start the whole thing again next week. The whole conversation again, right? With the like, do we have a shared understanding within this group? Can we move forward with the questions as well, which will be an interesting one for next week.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So who wants to do summary messaging and things? Again, I'll get kind of the video out for people. That's on me, but who wants to do summary messaging and reminder messaging and all of that for this one for operations?
What do you mean? Just like some
Just
notes?
like out to yeah, like we've got the note stock and this thing, and we want people to be able to add questions to it and be. I think we talked about last week that it was helpful to have somebody sort of send a reminder partway through the week. Hey, if you haven't gotten to it yet, like reminder, go put some stuff in. So just sort of some of the admin-y things that are nice to share around. It means that people don't ignore it because it's a new voice in the Slack message. Basically, if I'm sending it all the time, people are like, oh, Abby talking again. Got to get her out of my head twice in one day, too many times, you know.
Like I can probably get around to it tomorrow night or
Didn't
Thursday.
you do last
but
week, Stefan?
Yeah, I did.
You did a good job.
Like-
I'm just reading it now today. So.
But if nobody else is doing it, I should do it.
He did a good job.
We can rotate.
It's more like
If
can't
no one
do it
else
today,
wants
so.
to volunteer and rotate it, we could alternate at least.
Sure.
Right, David, you're up then, I guess. Unless anyone else wants to step in. Or prepare themselves for next week to offer and start a wider rota. Feel free to do that as well.
I'll prepare myself for next week, and I'll take notes next week.
Good
right?
guilting, David. Good guilting. You
That's
got
good.
it.
I was about to say like, jokes on us now, David.
Yeah, no. Great.
You've done your
Stand up.
shift, right?
Awesome.
Do
Awesome.
I get a badge for it?
I'll take notes next week. I'll do it next week then, right?
Absolutely lovely.
Yeah,
Well,
See
actually,
you all-
I better check next Tuesday is not my works night out, Christmas night out. That's the
Oh.
only thing.
No, I want the Chris notes after the works night out. That's when I want the notes.
You've seen my drunk notes, Abby, right?
But yeah, we'll figure it out next week on who it is. If Chris is here, he can take it on. If not, we'll figure out someone else. It'll all be good.
It
But yeah,
looks like
thank
I'm
you all.
good.
This has been really good. Definitely flagged up. Interfaces will get revisited quickly. So
Okay.
for sure.
All right, thanks all.
All right.
Cheers.
See you
Bye,
all.
See you
all.
next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Bye.